There is a hill in the middle of Ottawa, right at the heart of Canada's capital, where the most powerful building in the country sits on a cliff above the Ottawa River. Millions of people have photographed it. Millions more have walked its manicured grounds, posed in front of its Gothic spires, watched its changing of the guard on a bright summer morning. It is one of the most recognizable skylines in the entire Western world. Tourists come from every continent to stand on that lawn and look up at those towers and feel, in some vague patriotic way, that they are looking at something solid, something settled, something permanent, and the government of Canada is perfectly happy for you to feel that way. What they are considerably less happy about is what you might start thinking if you look a little more carefully. Not at the building itself, not at its Victorian stonework, or its copper roofing, or its famous Peace Tower, but at the ground underneath it, at the cliff below it, at the river rushing past it, at the sheer age of the land on which the whole thing sits. Because here is what the official tours do not mention. Here is what the Parks Canada brochures gloss over in a sentence or two. Here's what the archaeologists who have spent careers studying pre-contact North America will tell you in quiet voices when they think no one important is listening. Parliament Hill is one of the most archaeologically significant sites on the entire continent, and for a very long time the Canadian government has been doing everything in its considerable power to make sure that nobody digs deep enough to find out exactly what that means. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Let's start with the river. The Ottawa River is not a gentle waterway. It is wide and fast and ancient in the way that Canadian rivers are ancient, which is to say in a way that makes human timescales feel almost embarrassingly small. The Ottawa drains an enormous watershed, pulling water from as far north as the height of land between the Great Lakes and Hudson Bay, carrying it southeast and south until it finally joins the St. Lawrence near Montreal. It has been doing this for a very long time, not thousands of years, not tens of thousands of years. The river, in its current basic form, has been flowing since the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet, which means we are talking about a waterway that has been in roughly continuous operation for somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years. Maybe longer depending on which geologist you ask and how generous they are feeling about their estimates. Now think about what that means for the people who live near it. When Europeans arrived in the St. Lawrence and Ottawa Valley in the early 17th century, they found a landscape that was, to their eyes, wild and trackless and essentially empty. They wrote about it in those terms. They described forests that seemed to have no end, and rivers that no civilized man had ever mapped, and indigenous peoples who, in the European view, had simply always been there, unchanging, timeless, without history, in the sense that Europeans understood that word. This view was wrong in almost every particular, and historians have spent the better part of 2 centuries documenting exactly how wrong it was. But it persisted. It persisted because it was convenient, and the residue of that convenient wrongness is still embedded in the official story of places like Parliament Hill. Here is what we actually know about the Ottawa Valley and its human history, assembled from archaeology, linguistics, oral tradition, and genetic research conducted over the past 50 years. People have been living in the Ottawa Valley for at minimum 10,000 years. Some sites in the broader region push that estimate back considerably further. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were not primitive. They had trade networks that extended hundreds of miles in every direction. They had complex social structures. They had technologies refined over generations for surviving and thriving in one of the most demanding, temperate environments on Earth. They had relationships with the land so detailed and so specific that modern ecologists are still working to understand what those relationships produced, what the landscape of the Ottawa Valley looked like before European contact, and how much of what Europeans interpreted as wild nature was actually the product of 10,000 years of careful human management. And they had a name for the place where Parliament Hill now stands. In the language of the Algonquin people, whose territory has encompassed the Ottawa Valley for as far back as oral tradition reliably reaches, the place was called Kichi-Sibi, which translates roughly as Great River, though the translation loses something in the crossing. The river was not merely large, it was alive. It was a presence with its own personality and its own power and its own history. The Algonquin relationship with Kichi-Sibi was not metaphorical. It was practical and spiritual and ecological all at once, in the way that these things were inseparable for people who had been living along that river for hundreds of generations. The specific promontory where Parliament Hill sits was recognized as significant long before any European ever laid eyes on it. The cliff itself, the dramatic drop to the river below, the natural defensibility of the position, the view it commanded over both the river and the surrounding landscape, these were not things that the indigenous peoples of the Ottawa Valley missed. They were not blind to the strategic and ceremonial importance of a site like that. In fact, the archaeological record strongly suggests they did not miss it at all. But here is where things start to get complicated. In 1826, a British military engineer named Lieutenant Colonel John By arrived in the Ottawa Valley with a mandate from the British government. His job was to build a canal. The Rideau Canal, connecting the Ottawa River to Kingston on Lake Ontario, was conceived as a military supply route that would be invulnerable to American attack. This was in the aftermath of the War of 1812, when the Americans had burned York, which is now Toronto, and the British had responded by burning Washington, and everyone involved was deeply nervous about what might happen next. The canal was a strategic investment. It was also an enormous engineering project, one of the largest undertaken in North America to that point, and it required a headquarters, a base of operations, a place from which Colonel By could oversee the whole enterprise. He chose the promontory above the Ottawa River. The settlement that grew up around his operations was called Bytown, and it was rough and noisy and violent and full of Irish and Scottish immigrants who had come to dig the canal by hand and who relieved the boredom and pain of that work by drinking prodigious quantities of alcohol and occasionally killing each other over matters of honor that in the light of sober mourning seemed considerably less urgent. Bytown was not, in those early years, anyone's idea of a capital city, but it grew, and in 1855 it was incorporated as the city of Ottawa, and 2 years later Queen Victoria chose it as the capital of the province of Canada, and the decision was made to build a proper parliament. The chosen site was the promontory above the river. Colonel By's old headquarters, the place the Algonquin had called Kichi-Sibi for longer than any written record reached. Construction began in 1859. What the builders found when they started to prepare the site is a matter of some historical controversy. The official record is thin in ways that historians have noted with increasing frustration. There are gaps in the documentation that would be unremarkable for a minor building project, but that are rather conspicuous for what was supposed to be one of the most carefully chronicled construction efforts in Canadian history. Things were found. That much is clear from fragmentary references in letters and journals and reports from the period. What those things were, how significant they were, what happened to them afterward, these questions are considerably harder to answer. What we do know is this: the limestone bedrock on which Parliament Hill sits is riddled with caves. Some of these caves were discovered during construction. Some were sealed, some were used for storage, and then forgotten. The river cliff below the hill is honeycombed with passages that geologists have mapped incompletely, and that archaeologists have visited only rarely and always under circumstances that seem, to outside observers, unusually controlled. We know that the Ottawa Valley was a major hub of indigenous activity for thousands of years before European contact. We know that the specific location of Parliament Hill was culturally significant to the Algonquin people. We know that construction in the mid-19th century was not conducted with anything like modern archaeological sensitivity, which means that whatever was in that ground was encountered by workers who had no training, no protocols, and no particular interest in preserving anything that was not obviously and immediately valuable in the European sense of that word. And we know that when Indigenous leaders have formally requested archaeological surveys of the Parliament Hill site, those requests have been met with responses that range from bureaucratic delay to polite but firm refusal. The question is why. To understand why the question of what lies beneath Parliament Hill matters, you need to understand something about what the Ottawa Valley looked like before anyone thought to call it that. Forget the name for a moment. Forget the canals and the logging and the Parliament buildings. Go back, not to 1600 when the French were arriving in the St. Lawrence Valley, not to 1500 when the first epidemic diseases were beginning to ripple through indigenous communities ahead of any direct European contact. Go back further. Go back to the period that archaeologists call the Woodland Period, which in the Ottawa Valley runs from roughly 3,000 years ago to the time of European contact. And then go back further still to what they call the Archaic Period, which begins around 10,000 years ago when the glaciers finally finished their retreat and the land was young and raw and full of possibility. The people who moved into the Ottawa Valley in those first post-glacial centuries were not randomly wandering into an unknown landscape. They were following the land as it became habitable, tracking the northward movement of boreal forest, following the rivers that opened up like roads through the terrain. They were highly mobile, highly adaptable, sophisticated hunters and gatherers who knew how to read a landscape in ways that would have seemed almost supernatural to someone trained only in the European agricultural tradition. They knew which plants indicated water. They knew which geological formations sheltered the best tool stone. They knew how to find their way through hundreds of miles of forest, using the stars and the rivers and the patterns of wind and animal behavior. And they knew a good strategic position when they saw one. The promontory above the Ottawa River was by any standard a remarkable position. It commanded views up and down the river for miles in both directions. The cliff below it made it essentially unassailable from the water. The land behind it offered abundant forest resources and, crucially, access to good chert deposits that could be worked into cutting tools. The river itself at that location was a natural gathering point, a place where people moving along the waterway would stop, where trade goods would change hands, where information about conditions further north or south would be exchanged. In other words, it was exactly the kind of place where people would stop, and then stop again, and then stop again after that, until eventually stopping there was not a decision but a habit, until the habit became a tradition, until the tradition accumulated the weight of generations, and the place became something more than a convenient campsite. It became significant in ways that are hard to translate into the language of modern archaeology, but that show up clearly in the archaeological record as concentrations of artifacts, as evidence of repeated use, as the kind of layered deposition that tells a trained eye that people kept coming back here, kept coming back here, kept coming back here for a very long time. The archaeological sites closest to Parliament Hill that have actually been surveyed, and there are precious few of them given the sensitivity of the location, tell this story in fragmentary ways. Flake stone tools, fire-cracked rock, traces of hearths, ceramics from the woodland period that indicate not just presence, but habitation, people who were not just passing through, but staying, cooking, making tools, living in that place in some sustained and organized way. And these are the sites that have been surveyed, the sites on the periphery, the sites that are not directly underneath the most heavily protected and carefully managed piece of real estate in the entire country. Here is something that most people do not know about Canadian heritage law, or rather about the specific way it applies or fails to apply to federal property. In Canada, archaeological resources on provincial land are regulated by provincial legislation. This means that if you want to build something in Ontario, say, and there is reason to believe the land might contain archaeological resources, you need to go through an archaeological assessment process. You need to hire a licensed archaeologist. You need to follow protocols. You may need to excavate and document and preserve whatever is found. The system is imperfect. Critics will tell you it is badly underfunded and frequently bypassed. But it exists. There are rules. There is oversight. Federal land is different. Parliament Hill is federal land. The land on which the Centre Block, the West Block, the East Block, the Library of Parliament, and the surrounding grounds sit is federal property managed by Public Services and Procurement Canada and Parks Canada. And federal land in Canada operates under a different regime. The federal government is not subject to provincial heritage legislation. It has its own policies, which are substantially more flexible, substantially more discretionary, and substantially less subject to independent oversight than the provincial systems. What this means in practice is that the Canadian federal government is essentially the authority that decides what archaeological work happens on Parliament Hill. It decides when surveys are conducted. It decides what protocols are followed. It decides what is published and what is not published. It decides, in other words, what gets known and what does not get known about what lies beneath the most politically sensitive piece of ground in the country. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is simply how the law works. And when you understand how the law works, the patterns of what has and has not happened archaeologically on Parliament Hill begin to look less like coincidence and more like policy. The most recent major opportunity to learn something about what lies beneath Parliament Hill came with the Centre Block Rehabilitation Project, which began in earnest around 2018. The Centre Block, which is the main parliamentary building containing the House of Commons, the Senate, and the famous Peace Tower, had been in need of major restoration for years. Deferred maintenance had allowed serious problems to accumulate. The decision was made to undertake a comprehensive rehabilitation that would see the entire building emptied of its functions, which were temporarily relocated to other facilities and subjected to what was described as a major and long overdue restoration. This project, which is expected to take years and which involves extensive work in and around the foundations of the building, should in theory represent an extraordinary archaeological opportunity. Anytime you disturb the ground around a building that has sat on an archaeologically significant site for over 150 years, you have the potential to learn something. Anytime construction work penetrates below the surface in a place where people lived for thousands of years, you have the potential to encounter material that changes what we know. The federal government acknowledged this. They committed to archaeological monitoring of the project. They brought in professional archaeologists. They said the right things about heritage sensitivity and indigenous consultation and responsible stewardship. And then they carefully controlled what information came out the other side. The Algonquin people of the Ottawa Valley have been asking for recognition of their connection to Parliament Hill for a very long time. Not recognition in the abstract, feel-good sense that produces plaques and acknowledgement ceremonies. Recognition in the concrete, legally meaningful sense that would give them a seat at the table when decisions are made about what happens to the land and what is done with whatever is found in it. This is a sensitive political issue in Canada, and I want to be careful about how I frame it, because the people involved are real, and the stakes for them are real, and the history is painful in ways that a documentary script can only gesture at. The Algonquin Nation has been engaged in a land claim process with the Canadian government for decades. The claim covers a vast swath of territory in Ontario and Quebec, including the Ottawa Valley and the city of Ottawa itself. Parliament Hill sits squarely within the territory that the Algonquin people claim has never been ceded through treaty. Unlike many parts of Canada, where Indigenous land rights were extinguished through treaties, however flawed and often broken. Those treaties were, the Ottawa Valley was never properly treated. The Algonquin people did not sign away their connection to Kichi-Sibi. The British and later Canadian governments simply proceeded as if they had. This matters archaeologically because it means that any cultural materials found beneath Parliament Hill, any artifacts, any human remains, any evidence of past use of that land would potentially be Algonquin cultural property under Canadian and international law. The federal government's obligations to the Algonquin people regarding such materials are significant and, in the context of a land claim, politically complicated. There have been Algonquin cultural monitors involved in the Center Block rehabilitation project. This is acknowledged. What is less clear is the degree to which their input has shaped what is actually done with anything that is found, and what access they have to the results of archaeological monitoring. The communications that have come from the federal government on this subject are carefully worded in ways that archaeologists and Indigenous rights advocates have noticed. There is transparency about process. There is considerably less transparency about findings. When you ask specific questions, you encounter specific frustrations. What artifacts have been recovered from excavations associated with the Center Block rehabilitation? What is their age? What do they tell us about pre-contact use of the site? Where are they now? Who has access to the archaeological reports? These are not unreasonable questions. They are, in fact, exactly the questions that a functioning heritage protection system should be able to answer, and the answers, when they come, tend to be carefully incomplete. Let me tell you about the caves. The limestone bedrock of the Ottawa River Valley is not solid. It is layered and fractured and full of passages carved by water over millennia. The Ottawa River itself, at low water, exposes sections of the cliff below Parliament Hill that hint at the complexity of what lies beneath. There are passages that go back into the rock. There are chambers. There are places where the bedrock has been hollowed out by centuries of seeping water into spaces that are genuinely significant in size. The government knows about these. The engineering surveys that have been conducted over the decades in connection with various maintenance and construction projects have documented the existence of void spaces beneath and around the parliamentary precinct. This is a matter of public record in the sense that references to it appear in various government documents, though the details are invariably vague and the access to supporting documentation is invariably limited. What is not a matter of public record is what, if anything, is in those voids. Limestone caves in the Ottawa Valley context are interesting for several reasons. First, they are excellent preservation environments. Materials that would decay in open-air conditions can survive for remarkable lengths of time in the cool, damp, stable environment of a limestone cave. Organic materials, wooden objects, textiles, things that would never survive in an open archaeological site can survive in a cave. Second, caves in this region were used by Indigenous peoples for a variety of purposes. Some were used as shelters. Some appear to have been used for storage. Some show evidence of ceremonial use. The specific use of any given cave depended on its characteristics, its accessibility, its location relative to other resources and places. Third, the caves beneath Parliament Hill, to the extent that they exist and have been accessed, are in a location that would have made them highly relevant to whoever was using the promontory above. I am not telling you that there is a vast underground complex of indigenous ceremonial chambers beneath the Canadian Parliament. I am not in a position to make that claim, and I would not make it even if I were, because I do not have the evidence for it, and because that kind of overstatement does nobody any good. What I am telling you is that the conditions are right for something to be there, that the geological environment is conducive to preservation, that the location is exactly the kind of place where past use would have been intensive and sustained, that the government has documented the existence of subsurface voids without being forthcoming about their contents, and that the combination of these factors, in the context of a site where archaeological investigation has been consistently limited and controlled, is the kind of thing that responsible historians and archaeologists notice. Let me shift gears for a moment and talk about what we know about pre-contact North America more broadly, because the argument for why Parliament Hill might be significant cannot be made without some context about the civilization, and I use that word deliberately, that existed on this continent before European contact. The popular image of pre-contact North America is one of small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers living in essentially unchanged conditions across a vast, wild continent. This image is wrong. Not in some minor technical sense, but fundamentally, comprehensively, wrong in ways that the last 30 years of archaeology and genetics and historical ecology have been systematically documenting. The reality of pre-contact North America was complex, dynamic, populous, and in many regions what you would have to call, by any reasonable definition, civilized. Let's talk numbers, because numbers are where the old narrative starts to fall apart most dramatically. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, how many people were living in the Americas? For most of the 20th century, the scholarly consensus held that the answer was somewhere between 8 and 18 million, total, for both continents combined. This number is almost certainly drastically wrong. Current scholarship, based on more sophisticated modeling of land capacity, disease mortality rates, and the accounts of early European observers who actually saw the populations before disease had finished its work, suggests numbers ranging from 50 million to 100 million people in the Americas at the time of contact. Some estimates go higher. These are not fringe figures. They are the product of serious scholarly work by serious historians and archaeologists and epidemiologists working at major research institutions. The low numbers of the old consensus were themselves products of a kind of intellectual convenience. If there were not very many people here before Europeans arrived, then the land was not really occupied in any meaningful sense, and the European project of taking it could be narrated as exploration rather than conquest. The higher numbers change everything about how you have to think about the pre-contact Americas. 50 to 100 million people need to be somewhere. They need to be organized. They need to produce food. They need to have social structures capable of managing large populations. They need to have built things. They need to have developed the kind of complexity that supports large numbers of people over extended periods of time. And they did. The evidence is there, scattered across the continent, imperfectly documented, frequently misinterpreted, and in some cases actively suppressed because it challenges a narrative about this land that powerful interests have spent centuries constructing and defending. Cahokia, the ancient city near modern-day St. Louis, was at its peak around the year 1100 AD, larger than London was at that same time. Let that settle for a moment. There was a city in North America that was larger than the largest city in medieval England. It had a sophisticated urban layout, a monumental architecture, a complex political organization, and trade networks that extended from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. And most Americans and Canadians have never heard of it in any detail. The Hopewell tradition, which flourished across a large part of eastern North America from roughly 100 BC to 500 AD, left behind earthwork monuments of extraordinary scale and precision. Geometric earthworks covering hundreds of acres. Burial mounds containing artifacts made from materials sourced from every corner of the continent. Evidence of a ceremonial and trade network so extensive and so well organized that archaeologists who first excavated its sites in the 19th century refused to believe that indigenous peoples had built them and invented a fictional lost race of mound builders to explain what they were seeing. It took decades of patient scholarship to correct this mistake, and the correction is still not widely known outside academic circles. Closer to the Ottawa Valley, the St. Lawrence Iroquoian cultures that Europeans first encountered when Cartier sailed up the river in the 1530s were already in a state of profound disruption. The large, sophisticated, densely populated towns that Cartier documented had essentially vanished by the time Champlain arrived 70 years later, replaced by a landscape that looked considerably more sparse and simple. What happened in those 70 years is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, but the epidemic disease hypothesis, the idea that European diseases move through indigenous networks far ahead of direct European contact, wiping out populations before Europeans ever met them, is now considered the most likely explanation. The land that Europeans described as empty or lightly populated was often land from which the population had recently been catastrophically removed. What all of this means for the Ottawa Valley, and for Parliament Hill specifically, is that the absence of obvious, large-scale pre-contact sites in the immediate vicinity of the hill tells us much less than you might think. The Ottawa Valley was a major corridor of movement and exchange. The Kichisibi, the Great River, was a highway through the interior. The specific promontory that Parliament Hill occupies was, by any reasonable assessment, a place of sustained significance. And the diseases that preceded European contact moved through the Ottawa Valley, as they moved through virtually everywhere else in northeastern North America, leaving populations devastated and landscapes changed before anyone with European eyes was there to see the before and compare it to the after. There is a concept in archaeology called a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over, but where traces of the earlier writing still show through. Archaeological sites are palimpsests. Each period of use leaves traces on top of the traces left by the period before. A skilled archaeologist, excavating carefully, layer by layer, can read those traces like text, can reconstruct, at least partially, the sequence of occupation and use, can say, this layer represents this period, and the layer below it represents an earlier period, and below that, an earlier period still. Parliament Hill, if it were excavated systematically and with modern methods, would be one of the most significant palimpsests in North America. The layers would start, presumably, near the surface with the British colonial period, the construction of the original Parliament buildings, the landscaping and improvements that followed. Below that, the earlier colonial period, the Bytown era, By's own establishment. Below that, the period of sustained indigenous use, which could extend back many thousands of years. And below that, potentially, evidence from the very earliest human occupation of the Ottawa Valley, from the post-glacial period when the land was still raw and young, and the people moving into it were among the first humans ever to set foot in this part of the world. This sequence, if it could be documented, would be remarkable, not just for what it would tell us about Parliament Hill specifically, but for what it would tell us about the entire sweep of human history in this part of North America. It would be a resource of extraordinary scholarly value, a site comparable in its potential significance to the great palimpsest sites of the Old World, places where continuous human occupation over millennia has created layered records of human history that archaeologists have spent careers trying to read. But to read a palimpsest, you have to open it, you have to dig, and that is precisely what is not happening, at least not in any comprehensive, open, systematically documented way, at Parliament Hill. Let me tell you about the Gatineau Hills, directly across the Ottawa River from Parliament Hill in the province of Quebec. The Gatineau Hills rise sharply from the north shore of the river. They are not tall mountains. The highest points reach only about 400 meters above sea level. But they are geologically interesting in ways that matter for this story because they are full of caves, limestone and marble, and other soluble rocks shaped by water, over millions of years into passages and chambers that range from navigable tunnels to cathedral-scale rooms. The Gatineau Hills have been known to archaeologists for many years, and some work has been done there. Not nearly enough, critics of the pace of Ottawa Valley archaeology will tell you, but some. And what that work has found is consistent with what we would expect from a landscape that has been occupied by humans for 10,000 years. Artifacts, evidence of habitation, evidence of use that extends through multiple archaeological periods. But the Gatineau Hills are also interesting for another reason. They are, in some respects, the mirror image of Parliament Hill, the promontory north of the river looking south toward the Great Cliff. In indigenous geographical thinking, which tends to organize landscape relationally, rather than in the grid-based way that European mapping imposes, the two sides of the river would not have been separate places. They would have been parts of the same place. The relationship between the cliff and the hills across the water, the view from one to the other, the specific dynamics of the river at that point where it narrows and speeds, all of these would have been part of the meaning of the location. This is relevant because archaeological investigation in the Gatineau Hills has occasionally turned up things that are difficult to fit into the conventional narrative of pre-contact Ottawa Valley history. Evidence of occupation and use that is more intensive, more organized, more suggestive of deliberate and sustained activity than the hunter-gatherer model that has traditionally been applied to this region would easily accommodate. These findings have not been widely publicized. Some of them exist only in gray literature. The unpublished or semi-published reports that archaeologists produce, but that rarely make it into the academic journals where findings become part of the general scholarly conversation. There are archaeologists who will tell you, quietly, in conversations that they do not necessarily want attributed, that the Ottawa Valley is significantly under-archaeologically investigated, that the conventional picture of the pre-contact history of this region is based on a surprisingly thin evidentiary base, that there are findings that have not been adequately followed up, that the pace and scope of investigation has been shaped by factors that have nothing to do with scholarly interest and everything to do with political and legal sensitivity. They are not wrong. In the summer of 1914, before the First World War consumed everyone's attention for 4 years, a peculiar document circulated among certain Ottawa historians and antiquarians. It was a transcript, allegedly, of an account given by an elderly Algonquin man to a missionary priest sometime in the mid-19th century. The document described, in somewhat garbled form, a tradition associated with the great cliff above the river. The cliff, in this account, was not merely a geographic feature. It was a place, a named place, a place with a history. The account, as transcribed, described the cliff as having been used as a gathering point for as long as anyone's memory reached. There were ceremonies conducted there. There were things kept there, in the rock, below the surface, in places that had been prepared for keeping. The account was specific enough about the location to be interesting and vague enough about the contents to be frustrating. What exactly was kept? The transcript was unclear, or the translator had been unclear, or the original speaker had deliberately not been clear. But the sense was of something significant, something that had been placed there with care and intention, something that people had gone back to repeatedly over many generations. The document's provenance is uncertain. Historians who have looked at it are divided about its authenticity. It may be genuine. It may be a 19th century fabrication. It may be genuine but garbled by translation and transmission in ways that have distorted its original meaning beyond recovery. I cannot tell you that this document proves anything, because it does not. Documents of uncertain provenance do not prove anything. What they do is raise questions, and the question this one raises is uncomfortable. If there are things in the rock beneath Parliament Hill, things placed there with care and intention, by people who had been using that place for thousands of years, what happened to them? When the construction crews arrived in 1859 to begin excavating for the foundations of the new Parliament buildings, what did they find, and what did they do with what they found? The historical record for the Parliament Hill construction is thinner than you would expect. This has been noted by historians. The official correspondence that has survived documents the broad strokes of the project, the contracts, the budgets, the disputes, the structural decisions, but it is notably sparse on the specifics of what was encountered in the ground. Workers' personal accounts from the period, the kind of informal record that sometimes preserves details that official documentation misses, are similarly uninformative about the excavation itself. This could mean that nothing remarkable was found. It could mean that what was found was unremarkable, enough to be disposed of without comment, broken sherds, and flake stone from a site that the workers and supervisors of 1859 would not have been trained to recognize as significant. Or it could mean something else. There is a name that comes up in conversations about the early history of Parliament Hill that is worth knowing. Thomas Coltrane. Kiefer was a Canadian civil engineer and writer, one of the prominent figures of his era, a man whose observations on the development of Canada were taken seriously by the people who mattered in the middle of the 19th century. He wrote about the Ottawa River. He wrote about the settlement of the valley. He was paying attention, and he was educated, and he kept notes. Kiefer's notes from the 1850s include a reference that has attracted the attention of the few historians who have stumbled across it. He mentions in passing that the construction of the parliamentary buildings has necessitated the removal of various traces of earlier occupation of the site, and that some of these traces are of a character that suggests the site has been used for purposes of some importance at a period considerably earlier than any European record. He notes that the workers have taken little interest in what they have found, which in Kiefer's view is regrettable, but not surprising given their general level of education and their lack of familiarity with antiquarian subjects. He does not describe what was found in any detail. He moves on to other subjects. The reference is brief enough that most historians who have read his papers have not flagged it as significant. But it is there. A mid-19th century civil engineer, not given to romantic exaggeration, noting that something was found during the Parliament Hill excavations that suggested the site had been used for important purposes at a very early date. What was found? We do not know. Where did it go? We do not know. Was it preserved, documented, sent to a museum somewhere that might have records of its arrival? No such records have been identified, though I will acknowledge that the search has been imperfect. 19th century museum records are notoriously incomplete, and the specific provenance of individual artifacts is often lost, even when the artifacts themselves survive. But Kiefer's note is there, and it is the kind of thing that makes historians want to dig further. Literally. Let us talk about the archaeological context of the broader Ottawa Valley in more detail, because I think the significance of the Parliament Hill question depends on understanding what the valley was, what role it played in the pre-contact history of northeastern North America. The Ottawa River was, in the millennia before European contact, one of the great highways of the continent. It connected the Great Lakes Basin to the St. Lawrence Valley. It gave access, via its tributaries, to vast regions of the Canadian Shield to the north. It was navigable, more or less, over its entire length, with portages around the rapids that marked its descent from the interior. Goods and people and ideas moved along it constantly. The wampum belts and copper ornaments and chert tools and other objects that archaeologists find at Ottawa Valley sites come from sources spread across hundreds of miles, testimony to the scale and complexity of the exchange networks that the river supported. At the confluence of rivers, at the portages around rapids, at the natural gathering points along the route, communities formed. These communities were not permanent settlements in the sense that European agricultural villages were permanent settlements, but they were not random. They were return sites, places people came back to, season after season, generation after generation, places where the accumulated evidence of repeated use built up in the ground over centuries. Parliament Hill is at the junction of the Ottawa River with the Rideau River, one of its major tributaries. The Rideau Falls, where the Rideau River drops into the Ottawa just downstream from the hill, were a significant landmark, a place where the practical business of navigation required a stop and where the dramatic physical character of the landscape created the kind of impression that places in indigenous geographical thinking tended to accumulate meaning around. The combination of the falls, the river junction, the Great Cliff, and the commanding view over the wider river system made the Parliament Hill location one of the most naturally significant points on the entire Ottawa River system. This is not speculation. This is basic human geography. People throughout history, across cultures, have tended to mark and use and return to places of natural significance. The dramatic and strategically important positions, the confluences, the prominent landmarks, the places where the landscape itself seems to draw the eye. Parliament Hill is all of these things. The idea that it was not significant to the people who lived in the Ottawa Valley for thousands of years before Europeans arrived requires you to believe that those people were essentially blind to their own landscape, which everything we know about pre-contact peoples suggests is exactly wrong. Now I want to talk about something that is less speculative and more documented, because I think it is important to balance the more uncertain historical questions with things we can actually point to. There is a body of archaeological work that has been done in the Ottawa Valley, not on Parliament Hill itself, but in its vicinity, that establishes beyond any reasonable doubt the long and intensive pre-contact use of the region. This work is not secret. It is published, or at least many of it is. What it is underknown, because Ottawa Valley pre-contact archaeology does not get the kind of public attention that Cahokia gets, or that the Mayan ruins get, or that Stonehenge gets. It sits in the gray literature and in the pages of specialized journals, and in the archives of provincial archaeology programs, available to those who look for it, but not exactly advertised to the general public. One of the most interesting bodies of this work relates to the archaic period sites along the Ottawa River and its tributaries. These are sites that date to the period between roughly 8,000 and 3,000 years ago. They document the use of the river valley by people whose technology was essentially stone-based, but whose sophistication in using that technology, in organizing their societies, and in managing their relationships with the landscape was considerably more developed than the stereotype of primitive hunter suggests. The artifact assemblages from these sites include points of considerable technical refinement, ground stone tools that indicate food processing on a scale consistent with substantial populations, copper artifacts, actual copper, worked from sources in the Great Lakes region that arrived in the Ottawa Valley through exchange networks of remarkable extent, burial sites that show evidence of social differentiation, of some individuals receiving treatment in death that was different from and more elaborate than the treatment received by others, which is one of the markers archaeologists use to identify societies that have moved beyond simple egalitarianism toward more complex social organization. These findings are not consistent with the image of small, simple bands barely scratching a living from the forest. They are consistent with an image of communities that were organized, that were connected, that were socially complex, and that were using the Ottawa Valley intensively over many thousands of years, and the most intensive use of the most significant locations in the valley, by the logic of everything we know about how pre-contact peoples related to their landscapes would have been at the most significant locations. The confluence of major rivers, the dramatic promontories, the places where the landscape made a statement and where people, over generations, amplified that statement with their own activities and their own meanings. Parliament Hill. Let me tell you about the Peace Tower. The Peace Tower is the great central tower of the center block, the one you see in every photograph of Parliament Hill. It stands 92 meters tall. It contains a carillon of 53 bells. It has a memorial chamber at its base dedicated to Canadians who have died in war. It was completed in 1927, after the original center block burned in a spectacular fire in 1916. The tower is one of the most recognizable symbols of Canada, as iconic in its way as any landmark in the country. At the base of the Peace Tower, below the memorial chamber, below the public areas of the building, below the level at which the typical visitor ever goes, are the foundations. Stone and concrete driven into the limestone bedrock of Parliament Hill in 1916 and the years following. And around those foundations, and in some cases penetrating into the limestone bedrock itself, are voids. Spaces in the rock, some of them natural, some of them modified, the product of the particular geological character of this site. The engineering reports for the center block rehabilitation project have acknowledged the existence of these voids. They are a structural concern. Voids in the bedrock beneath a major building are not something you ignore. They need to be assessed, mapped, and in some cases filled or reinforced. The engineering work associated with the rehabilitation has required by necessity engagement with these subsurface features. What that engagement has found is not fully public. I am not suggesting conspiracy. I want to be clear about that. The non-disclosure of detailed subsurface investigation findings from a major federal building project can be explained in several mundane ways. Engineering reports are often proprietary. Security concerns about the detailed layout of subsurface features beneath a major government building are legitimate. The legal complexity of the Algonquin land claim creates legitimate reasons for caution about publicly characterizing any archaeological findings in ways that might prejudice ongoing negotiations. But all of these legitimate explanations for incomplete disclosure do not eliminate the underlying question. The question of what is down there. The question of what has been found. The question of whether what has been found is significant, and if so, significant in what way, and significant to whom. These are questions that a country committed to reconciliation with its indigenous peoples, a country that has made formal commitments to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a country that has launched truth and reconciliation processes and signed agreements and made statements about the importance of indigenous history and heritage should be finding ways to answer. Not in secret, not through a process of controlled information management, but openly, collaboratively, and with the full participation of the Algonquin Nation, whose ancestors are the ones who made the site significant in the first place. There is a specific story that has circulated among Ottawa historians and Algonquin knowledge keepers for a long time, a story that I want to address directly because it represents the kind of claim that can easily be dismissed as legend, and that may, in fact, be more than legend. The story concerns the caves below the cliff face on the riverside of Parliament Hill. These caves are partially visible at low water. They have been noted in historical accounts going back to the early 19th century. Various Bytown-era writers mention them, usually as curiosities, as geological features of interest rather than as sites of human significance. But in Algonquin oral tradition, as it has been reported by various researchers over the years, these caves were not merely geological curiosities. They were sites, they had histories, they were associated with specific events and specific uses, some of which were ceremonial and some of which were practical, in the way that pre-contact indigenous peoples combine the ceremonial and the practical in ways that European categories tend to separate. One version of the tradition, reported in academic literature from the latter half of the 20th century, describes the caves as places where offerings were made, where items of significance were deposited, and where, in times of particular importance, knowledge was preserved. Knowledge in a physical form, knowledge that was meant to last. The tradition is specific enough to be interesting and general enough to be frustrating in exactly the way that oral traditions often are when they are recorded by outsiders who may not have had the linguistic or cultural framework to capture their full meaning. Now, I am not going to tell you that there is a treasure vault beneath Parliament Hill. I am not going to tell you that there are ancient scrolls or artifacts of civilizational importance hidden in the limestone. That is the kind of claim that sounds exciting and that is completely unsupported by anything I can actually document. What I'm going to say is something more modest, and I think more genuinely interesting. If the Algonquin oral tradition about the caves beneath the Parliament Hill cliff is even partially accurate, and the record of indigenous oral traditions being partially accurate about things that can be independently verified is much better than Western scholarship used to assume, then there is a reasonable probability that the caves below Parliament Hill contain archaeological material. Material that was placed there deliberately by people who intended it to last. Material that might tell us something important about how the Ottawa Valley was used and what it meant to the people who used it. And if that material exists, and if it has not been destroyed by the construction and maintenance activities of the past century and a half, then the government's obligation to ensure it is properly investigated, properly protected, and properly shared with the Algonquin Nation is significant. The government knows this, which may be, at least in part, why the investigation has been controlled, rather than open. Let me take you to a different part of the story now, away from Parliament Hill itself, but still within the orbit of questions it raises. In the years after the Second World War, as Canada was expanding rapidly and building new infrastructure at a pace not seen since the railway era, construction projects across Ontario and Quebec began turning up pre-contact archaeological sites with an inconvenient regularity. The construction of new highways, the expansion of cities, the building of hydro dams, all of these activities required moving earth on a large scale, and moving earth on a large scale in a part of the world that had been occupied by humans for 10,000 years tends to produce things. The institutional response to these discoveries was, by modern standards, inadequate. Many sites were documented minimally and then built over. Many were not documented at all. Artifacts ended up in museum storerooms without proper provenience information, making them nearly useless for scientific analysis. Human remains, and there were human remains, were frequently handled with what can only be described as indifference, removed from their context and dealt with in ways that would be completely unacceptable under current standards and current law. But some things were documented, some were preserved, and the cumulative picture that emerges from the mid-20th century archaeology of the Ontario and Quebec portion of the Ottawa and St. Lawrence valleys is one of a region considerably more extensively occupied, considerably more complex in its social organization, and considerably more interesting from an archaeological standpoint than the conventional historical narrative of empty wilderness suggested. There are sites in this region that show evidence of occupation extending back to the very earliest post-glacial period. There are sites that document the development and elaboration of increasingly sophisticated material culture over thousands of years. There are sites that show the introduction of new technologies and new social practices from distant regions, carried along the river highways by the exchange networks that linked the eastern woodlands into a whole that was, in important respects, genuinely continental in its scale. And there are sites that show disruption, sudden breaks in occupation, evidence of conflict or catastrophe, evidence of populations moving rapidly in ways that speak of crisis rather than orderly adaptation. Some of these disruptions can be correlated with climatic events, some with the known movements of populations documented in the historical record. Some remain unexplained, episodes in the story of the Ottawa Valley's pre-contact history that are too fragmented to interpret with confidence. Parliament Hill sits at the center of this story, not as an isolated curiosity, but as a node in a network, a place that was connected to everything else that was happening in the region across thousands of years of human history. To understand Parliament Hill archaeologically, you have to understand the Ottawa Valley archaeologically. And to understand the Ottawa Valley archaeologically, you have to be willing to do the work of actually investigating the sites that can tell you the most, including the one that happens to have the Canadian Parliament sitting on top of it. I want to address something directly because it is a question that the framework of this story inevitably raises. Is this a cover-up? The word cover-up implies intentional, coordinated concealment of specific information that someone knows and is choosing not to share. It implies bad faith. It implies that there are people in the Canadian government who know exactly what is beneath Parliament Hill, know that it is significant, and are actively suppressing that information for reasons they would not defend if challenged. I cannot tell you that is what is happening. I do not have evidence for a cover-up in that specific sense. What I have evidence for is something considerably more mundane and in some ways more frustrating. I have evidence for a pattern of inadequate investigation, for decisions made over many decades that consistently prioritize the construction and maintenance of government buildings over the archaeological investigation of the ground beneath them, for a heritage protection framework that placed federal land outside the scope of the independent oversight mechanisms that applied to other land, for a legal and political environment shaped by the Algonquin land claim and by broader Indigenous rights questions that made thorough archaeological investigation of Parliament Hill politically complicated in ways that made slower and less thorough investigation not more attractive to decision makers than a comprehensive approach would have been. None of this requires bad faith in the strong sense. All of it is consistent with institutional self-interest, bureaucratic inertia, political caution, and the kinds of decisions that get made in large organizations when no one is specifically required to push for a more difficult course of action. But the result is the same, whether the cause is active, cover-up, or passive inadequacy. The most archaeologically significant federal property in Canada has not been comprehensively and openly investigated. The Algonquin Nation does not have the access to information about their ancestral site that reconciliation principles would suggest they should have. And the Canadian public does not know what lies beneath the building that is supposed to represent them. Let me walk you through the sequence of what has actually happened. Archaeologically, at Parliament Hill, insofar as that can be reconstructed from public sources. In the 19th century, during the original construction of the parliamentary buildings, there was no archaeological investigation in any meaningful sense. The concept of systematic archaeological excavation was barely developed at that point even in academic circles, let alone in the context of a practical construction project. Whatever was found incidentally, by workers who had no training in recognizing or preserving archaeological material. The fragmentary references in historical documents suggest that things were found but do not tell us what happened to them. In the early 20th century, as the parliamentary precinct was expanded and maintained, additional ground disturbance occurred. Again, there is no record of systematic archaeological investigation. The Great Fire of 1916 that destroyed the original center block and necessitated the construction of the current building was a massive event that involved significant ground disturbance during the rebuilding process. What, if anything, was documented during that process is not clear from available records. In the mid-20th century, as archaeological practice became more professionalized and as awareness of the significance of pre-contact sites grew, there were some assessments conducted in and around the parliamentary precinct. These were limited in scope. They were conducted by the National Capital Commission and by federal departments, responsible for the management of the properties. The results were not widely published. In the 1990s, as the legal framework around heritage protection and Indigenous rights was evolving, there were discussions about the need for a more systematic archaeological assessment of Parliament Hill and its environs. These discussions produced some additional limited investigation. They also produced recommendations for more comprehensive work that were not, as far as can be determined from available records, fully implemented. In the 2010s and into the 2020s, the Center Block Rehabilitation Project has proceeded with archaeological monitoring as a component. The Algonquin Nation has cultural monitors involved. Findings have been made. The public record of those findings is incomplete. This is the sequence. Decades of inadequate investigation punctuated by limited interventions and capped by a major project that is, at least in principle, being done with archaeological sensitivity, but that is not being done with the transparency that would allow independent assessment of whether the archaeological sensitivity is genuine and sufficient. Let me tell you about the Quiche-Sepirini. The Quiche-Sepirini were an Algonquin group who, at the time of the earliest European contact with the Ottawa Valley, occupied Morrison's Island in the Ottawa River. Morrison's Island is roughly 100 kilometers upstream from Parliament Hill, at a place where the river narrows and where the island creates a natural control point over river traffic. The Quiche-Sepirini, whose name translates roughly as people of the great river at the rock, were for a time one of the most powerful groups in the Ottawa Valley because they controlled access to the river highway through their territory. This is documented in the historical record. Samuel de Champlain, traveling through the Ottawa Valley in the early 17th century, encountered the Quiche-Sepirini and documented his encounters in some detail. He was struck by their organization, their confidence, and their evident sense of ownership over the river and its commerce. He was not dealing with simple hunter-gatherers who happened to be camped near a river. He was dealing with a polity that exercised control over a strategic resource and that had political relationships, negotiated alliances, and a clear sense of its own interests. The Quiche-Cipirini are, in the anthropological literature, sometimes cited as evidence that pre-contact Ottawa Valley Algonquin society was considerably more politically complex than the simple band model suggests. They had a chief who dealt diplomatically with Champlain on something close to equal terms. They had a political structure capable of making and enforcing decisions about who could use their section of the river. They had, in short, the kind of political organization that is usually only possible in societies with sufficient social complexity to support it. This matters for the Parliament Hill story because the Quiche-Cipirini were one of the groups that would have been most closely connected to the major gathering sites and ceremonial locations along the Ottawa River. Morrison's Island has produced one of the most significant archaeological assemblages in the Ottawa Valley, and the relationship between the Quiche-Cipirini and the Great Cliff at the Rideau, Ottawa confluence, the site of Parliament Hill, is not well documented, but is certainly plausible given the strategic and ceremonial importance of that location. Archaeology done at Morrison's Island in the latter part of the 20th century produced evidence of occupation extending back thousands of years, of trade goods from across the continent, and of ceremonial and burial practices consistent with a community of some social sophistication. It produced evidence, in other words, of the kind of society that would have recognized the significance of a place like Parliament Hill and would have used it accordingly. This chain of inference is not proof, but it is the kind of chain that a responsible archaeological program would follow up. It is the kind of chain that would argue for thorough investigation of the Parliament Hill site rather than the controlled and limited investigation that has actually occurred. There is a broader point I want to make, one that goes beyond Parliament Hill specifically and speaks to the nature of Canadian historical identity and the role that archaeological knowledge does or does not play in it. Canada has a complicated relationship with its pre-contact history. On the one hand, there is a formal commitment, encoded in treaties, in constitutional principles, in the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in Canada's adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to acknowledging and respecting Indigenous history and rights. On the other hand, there is a national narrative deeply rooted in the settler colonial project that places the beginning of meaningful Canadian history at the moment of European contact, or at the very latest at Confederation, at the moment the Dominion of Canada came into existence in 1867. Parliament Hill is the physical embodiment of that second narrative. It was built to represent a new nation, a nation that the architects and politicians of 1860 understood as fundamentally British, in character, in institutions, in values. The Gothic revival architecture of the parliamentary buildings was a deliberate choice, a statement about what Canada was and what tradition it was continuing. The landscape of the hill, the formal lawns, the statues of British monarchs and fathers of Confederation, the flame of the eternal flame, added in 1967 for the centennial. All of this is the material culture of the settler colonial narrative. It says this is where Canada began, and this is what it means. What a thorough archaeological investigation of Parliament Hill would do is complicate that narrative. Not destroy it, not necessarily challenge the legitimacy of the current institutions, but complicate it in ways that matter. It would establish, in the most concrete possible way, that the story of that particular piece of ground does not begin with European settlement, does not begin with Confederation, does not begin with any moment in the history of the Canadian state, but extends back thousands of years to people whose descendants are still here, still asserting their connection to that land, still waiting for the full measure of recognition that reconciliation is supposed to mean. That complication is, I suspect, part of why the investigation has been controlled. Not because there is a specific secret being hidden, not because archaeologists have found something so explosive that it would overturn Canadian political life, but because the very fact of a thorough investigation, the very acknowledgement that there is something significant to investigate, would require a kind of institutional humility that institutions rarely find it comfortable to exercise voluntarily. Let me describe for you a scenario that is, I want to be clear, speculative. This is not what I am claiming happened. This is a thought experiment about what might be discovered if Parliament Hill were thoroughly and openly investigated. Imagine that a comprehensive archaeological program conducted with full transparency and full Algonquin participation went to work on the Parliament Hill site. Imagine it began with the areas that are most accessible, the landscape grounds around the buildings, the areas where center block rehabilitation work has already disturbed the ground. And imagine that, as the archaeologists dug down through the 19th century construction debris, through the layers of Bytown-era occupation, they found something. Stone tools, not the casual scattered finds that turn up at almost any site in this part of the world, but a concentration. Tools in a variety of styles and periods, representing multiple occupations over many centuries. Tools made from materials that came from far away, that traveled along the river networks from the Great Lakes, from the Appalachians, from places hundreds of miles distant. Tools that tell a story of a site that was visited not once, but many times, by people connected to a vast exchange network. And below the tools, fire-cracked rock, hearths, the evidence of cooking and warmth and sustained presence. Not a temporary camp, but a return site, a place people came back to because it was important to come back to. And deeper still, in the undisturbed sediments near the cliff edge, the kinds of features that archaeologists find at sites of ceremonial importance, pits that were dug with intention, deposits that were placed with care, materials that were chosen for their symbolic significance rather than their practical utility, copper that came from the Great Lakes, shell that came from the Atlantic coast, things that traveled far to reach this place and were then placed in the ground with deliberation, and in the caves below the cliff, preserved in the cool and stable environment of the limestone, organic materials, wooden objects, worked bone, items that would have decayed in an open-air site, but that survived in the cave, items that represent a tradition of use, extending back to periods from which almost no organic material survives anywhere else in the Ottawa Valley. This is what a thorough investigation might find. Not alien technology, not ancient scrolls, not the kind of thing that generates exciting fictional narratives, but that strains credulity to the breaking point. But something genuinely significant, compelling evidence that the site of Canada's Parliament has a human history 10 times longer than the official narrative acknowledges, that it was a place of sustained importance to the people who lived in this valley for thousands of years, that those people were connected, organized, and sophisticated in ways that the old narrative of pre-contact simplicity consistently underestimates. That story, the real story, grounded in evidence and properly documented and shared openly with the Algonquin nation and with the Canadian public, would be extraordinary. It would not threaten the current institutions of Canadian democracy, but it would require those institutions to acknowledge something important about the land on which they sit, and that, apparently, is harder than it sounds. Let me talk about what happens to archaeological material in Canada that is sensitive. Canada has a formal policy framework for dealing with cultural property, including archaeological finds. The cultural property Export and Import Act governs the movement of cultural objects across borders. The Indian Act, which is deeply problematic in its origins and application, but which is still in force, contains provisions about the handling of indigenous cultural property. The various provincial heritage acts have provisions about the treatment of archaeological finds on provincial land, and at the federal level, there are policies governing the management of cultural resources on federal property. These frameworks are not empty. They contain real obligations, and they are enforced imperfectly but genuinely in many contexts. But they also contain gaps and ambiguities that create space for discretionary decisions, for choices about how thoroughly to investigate, how widely to share, and how much weight to give to indigenous interests in the management of cultural materials found on federal land. The key decisions in the Parliament Hill context are made by federal officials, by the people running the Center Block Rehabilitation Project, by the advisors to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, by the legal teams managing the Algonquin land claim, by the senior bureaucrats who have to balance heritage obligations against construction timelines and legal sensitivities and political considerations. These people are not archaeologists. They are not historians. They are managers and lawyers and political staff who are trying to do their jobs in a context where the archaeological and heritage dimensions of those jobs are one consideration among many. And in the calculus of a large federal construction project, the archaeological dimension tends to get the weight that the legal minimum requires it to get, not the weight that its genuine significance merits. This is a structural problem, not a personal one. It does not require anyone to be malicious. It requires only that the institutional framework consistently underweight archaeological and heritage concerns relative to construction and legal concerns, which it does consistently, because that is how institutions work when the people most affected by the underweighting, in this case the Algonquin Nation and the scholarly community interested in pre-contact North American history, do not have sufficient power within the institutional framework to insist on more. There is another dimension to this story that I have not yet fully addressed, one that connects the specific question of Parliament Hill to the broader and deeply troubling question of Indigenous human remains in Canadian collections. When the Algonquin people and other Indigenous nations raise the question of what lies beneath Parliament Hill, they are raising it in a context where Canada has a recognized and unresolved problem with the handling of Indigenous ancestral remains. Thousands of Indigenous human remains are held in museum collections, university collections, and government collections across Canada, the legacy of an era in which the remains of Indigenous people were collected for supposed scientific purposes with a callousness that is deeply disturbing to contemplate. The process of repatriation, of returning these remains to Indigenous communities, has been slow and incomplete. Some institutions have made significant progress, others have been much less forthcoming. The legal framework for repatriation is complex and in some respects inadequate. In this context, the question of whether there are ancestral remains in the subsurface of Parliament Hill is not merely academic. If construction or investigation at the site has encountered human remains, and the historical record of construction in the 1850s and 1860s and the 1910s provides no assurance that it has not, then the question of how those remains were treated and what happened to them is a serious one. It is a question of human dignity. It is a question of Indigenous rights. It is a question that the Canadian government, which has committed to reconciliation, has an obligation to answer fully and honestly. I cannot tell you whether such remains exist or have been found. I do not know. What I can tell you is that the question has not been satisfactorily answered, and that the process by which it would be answered, a truly comprehensive and transparent archaeological investigation, has not been undertaken. Let me tell you about the parliamentary precinct beyond Parliament Hill itself, because the archaeological potential of the area extends well beyond the specific buildings. The grounds between the East Block, the West Block, and the Centre Block, the formal lawns and paths of Parliament Hill itself, have been modified and landscaped over more than a century and a half. The fill has been moved, the grade has been adjusted, the natural topography of the site has been altered. But beneath these modifications, the original ground surface survives, at least in some areas, and with it the archaeological record of pre-contact use. On the eastern edge of the hill, closer to the Rideau Canal, the terrain drops away toward what was, before the canal was built, the natural floodplain of the Rideau River, where it joined the Ottawa. This area was heavily modified during canal construction in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The construction of the canal itself, a massive engineering undertaking that moved enormous quantities of earth and stone, would have disturbed and potentially destroyed archaeological material throughout this zone. To the west, toward what is now Spark Street and the broader downtown core of Ottawa, the terrain is less dramatically modified, but still affected by nearly 2 centuries of urban development. Archaeological work conducted in the Spark Street area over the years has found evidence of early colonial period occupation, but the pre-contact levels have rarely been investigated in detail. The most promising area for undisturbed pre-contact deposits on the available evidence remains the cliff face and the immediately adjacent areas, the places where the natural topography has constrained development most severely and where geological conditions have been most conducive to preservation. And it is precisely in these areas that investigation has been most limited. There is something I want to address about the nature of the claim I am making in this story, because I think it is important to be honest about the limits of what I know and what I am arguing. I am not claiming that there is a vast underground complex beneath Parliament Hill. I am not claiming that the Canadian government has found and suppressed evidence of a lost civilization. I am not claiming that Indigenous peoples were more technologically advanced than conventional archaeology suggests in ways that are inconsistent with the overall archaeological record. None of these things are what this story is about. What this story is about is considerably more mundane and in some ways considerably more important. It is about a site that, by every measure that archaeologists and historians use to assess significance, qualifies as highly significant, a site with 10,000 or more years of human history, a site at the confluence of major rivers, at a natural gathering point, at a place that was ceremonially and strategically important to the Indigenous peoples who lived in the region, a site where the conditions are favorable for the preservation of archaeological material, a site where construction and maintenance activities over a century and a half have repeatedly disturbed the ground without adequate archaeological documentation. It is about a system of federal heritage management that has consistently prioritized construction and political considerations over archaeological investigation. That has allowed the most significant federal property in the country to go unexcavated in any comprehensive sense. That has left questions about what lies beneath Parliament Hill unanswered, not because the answers would be explosive or civilization threatening, but because answering them fully and transparently would require a degree of institutional humility and Indigenous acknowledgement that has been so far politically inconvenient. And it is about a broader failure, not just of the Canadian government, but of the way that settler colonial societies have consistently failed to reckon with the depth and complexity of the pre-contact history of the land on which they sit, a failure that persists despite formal commitments to reconciliation, a failure that shows up most visibly, most concretely, most specifically at the single location that more than any other embodies what Canada claims to be, Parliament Hill. I want to tell you about a conversation that is documented in academic literature from the 1990s. An Algonquin elder was asked by a researcher what she thought about the Parliament buildings. Her response, as recorded, was something like this. She said that the buildings were on Algonquin land, that everyone knew that, and that the Algonquin people had never agreed to give that land away. She said that what was under the ground was still Algonquin, that the rock and what was in it remembered even if the buildings on top had forgotten. And then she said something that the researcher found striking enough to include in the published account, verbatim. She said that one day people would dig and they would be surprised, that they would find things they did not know were there, and then they would have to decide what to do with what they found, and that how they handled that decision would say a great deal about whether the promises they had made about reconciliation were real or whether they were just words. I find that striking too, not because it is mysterious or because it implies hidden knowledge, but because it captures something true about the situation. The decision about whether to fully investigate Parliament Hill and what to do with what is found and how to involve the Algonquin nation in that process is exactly the kind of decision that tests whether reconciliation means anything. So far, the test has produced a mixed result at best. The formal commitments are there. The monitoring programs are there. The Indigenous monitors are there. But the comprehensive, transparent, independently assessed archaeological investigation that would actually answer the question of what lies beneath the most important piece of federal property in Canada that is not there. Maybe it will come. The Center Block Rehabilitation Project is ongoing. The Algonquin land claim is ongoing. The political and legal landscape around Indigenous rights continues to evolve. There is pressure from scholars and from Indigenous leaders and from some within the government itself for a more thorough approach. Whether that pressure will produce results remains to be seen, but the hill is patient. The limestone is patient. Whatever is in the ground beneath the Peace Tower and the Senate and the House of Commons has been there a very long time. It can wait a little longer. The question is whether we can. Let me take you to something concrete, something that has actually been found, publicly documented, and that points toward the significance of the broader site, even if it does not directly address the question of what lies beneath the buildings. The Rideau River, where it enters the Ottawa just east of Parliament Hill, has been the site of occasional archaeological finds over the years. Some of these have been documented formally through salvage archaeology during construction or dredging operations. Some have been found informally by people walking the shoreline at low water, or by contractors who noticed something and decided to report it. The material from these finds includes stone tools from multiple periods, archaic period points from the period between 8 and 3,000 years ago, woodland period ceramics from the period leading up to European contact, occasional pieces of worked copper, animal bone with cut marks, the accumulation of material you would expect to find around a location where people stopped and worked and camped and conducted the business of their daily lives over many generations. None of this is dramatically new. None of it, on its own, tells us anything that is not already established about pre-contact use of the Ottawa Valley. But it is consistent. It is exactly what you would expect to find if people were using the area intensively for a very long time, and it is found at the edges, in the marginal areas where investigation has been possible. What it implies for the core of the site, the place that would have been most intensively used, and that now has a parliament sitting on it, is that the core would contain more, not less. The edges of a site are typically less intensively used than the center. If the edges are producing material consistent with sustained occupation over thousands of years, the center should be producing material consistent with even more intensive and sustained occupation, unless, of course, the center has been disturbed in ways that have destroyed or removed what was there, in which case the question of what was disturbed and what happened to it becomes more urgent, not less. Here is a thought that I find genuinely difficult. Imagine you are a senior official in the Canadian government in the 1970s or 1980s. Archaeological awareness has grown substantially. The Heritage Canada Foundation has been established. There is real political pressure to be seen as taking heritage seriously. And someone has just told you that preliminary work near Parliament Hill suggests the site is more archaeologically significant than anyone has previously acknowledged. What do? You have several options. You could commission a thorough investigation, document everything, publish the findings, and deal with the political and legal consequences of whatever is found. This is the right thing to do. It is also the most complex, the most expensive, the slowest, and the most potentially disruptive to ongoing processes, including the Algonquin land claim, which has been simmering since the 1970s, and which any significant archaeological finding would immediately complicate. Or you could commission a limited investigation. Document enough to satisfy the formal requirements. Control the publication of findings carefully. Ensure that whatever is reported is framed in ways that do not create obvious pressure for further action. This is the path of least resistance. It does not require anyone to tell an explicit lie. It simply requires a series of decisions that consistently err on the side of caution and institutional convenience. I am not saying that is what happened. I am saying that it is the kind of decision that institutions make, that it is the kind of decision that the available evidence is consistent with having been made, and that the result, a site of extraordinary potential significance that has been systematically under-investigated for decades, looks a great deal like the outcome of a series of such decisions. The story of Parliament Hill and what lies beneath it is not finished. It is ongoing. The rehabilitation project continues. The land claim continues. The conversations about reconciliation continue. The Algonquin nation continues to press for meaningful recognition of their connection to their ancestral territory. At some point, something is going to shift. The rehabilitation project will be completed and the buildings will be reopened, and all the attention that has been focused on the work inside the center block will shift elsewhere, and the opportunity that the project represented will have been taken or missed. The land claim will be resolved one way or another, and whatever resolution is reached will either include meaningful archaeological provisions or it will not. The political will to do reconciliation properly, to do it in ways that cost something, rather than merely in ways that feel good, will either develop or it will not. What I hope, and I say this as someone who has spent time with this material and who finds it genuinely compelling, is that the people making the decisions about what happens at Parliament Hill will recognize what is at stake, not just politically, not just legally, but historically, archaeologically, for the story of this land, for the story of the people who have lived on it, and for the story of what Canada actually is and how it actually came to be. Parliament Hill was not born in 1867. It was not born in 1826 when Colonel By chose his site. The ground on which it stands has a history that stretches back 10,000 years through periods of human habitation and use and meaning that the current buildings and the current institutions do not acknowledge and have not fully investigated. That history belongs not just to the Algonquin nation, though it belongs most directly and most urgently to them. It belongs to anyone who wants to understand this place, this river, this land. The hill is patient. The limestone is patient. The river is very, very patient. But patience has its limits, and the longer the question remains unanswered, the more of the answer is lost. Construction disturbs. Time decays. Opportunities close. Every year that passes without a comprehensive, open, transparent, and Algonquin-led archaeological investigation of the Parliament Hill site is a year in which something irreplaceable might be lost. The Government of Canada has not let anyone dig. Not really, not in the comprehensive, open, systematically documented way that the site's significance merits. The question of why not has several answers, and most of them are more mundane than exciting. But the mundane answers do not make the underlying situation less troubling. They make it more so, because a cover-up, at least, implies that someone somewhere knows what is there. The alternative, that the Canadian government simply has not cared enough to find out, or has found it convenient not to find out, is in some ways harder to accept. But whether it is active suppression or passive inadequacy, the result is the same. The most archaeologically significant piece of federal property in Canada remains incompletely and non-transparently investigated. The Algonquin Nation's ancestral connection to that property remains inadequately acknowledged in practice, whatever the formal rhetoric of reconciliation may say. And the full story of Parliament Hill, the real story, the 10,000-year story, remains buried in the limestone beneath the Peace Tower, waiting. The question is not whether there is something down there. The archaeology and the history and the common sense of human geography all say that there is. The question is what it is, what it means, and when Canada will decide that it is ready to find out. That day has not come yet, but the hill is patient, and the river remembers everything. Let me bring you to something that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. The Peace Tower stands 92 meters above the ground. From its observation deck, on a clear day, you can see for miles in every direction. You can see the Ottawa River stretching away to the east and to the west. You can see the Gatineau Hills on the north shore, their rounded profiles so different from the dramatic cliff on which you stand. You can see the city spreading south and east, the grid of streets and the low skyline and the glitter of the Rideau Canal in the distance. And if you look down, if you look at the ground directly below you, you are looking at somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years of human history. You're looking at the accumulated evidence of generation upon generation of people who stood approximately where you are standing, who looked at the same river and the same hills, who made decisions about this place that reflected their understanding of what it meant and what it was worth and what should be done here. They did not build Gothic towers. They did not debate legislation. They did not hold question period or conduct committee hearings or make speeches about Canadian values. But they were here. They were fully human. Their lives were as real and as complex and as meaningful as any life that has been lived in the building above you. And the traces of their presence are in the ground beneath your feet, waiting to be read by people with the skills and the will to read them. That is what Parliament Hill is. Not just the buildings, not just the institutions, not just the pageantry of Canadian democracy with its throne speeches and its swearing-in ceremonies and its Remembrance Day observances, but the whole thing, the ground and everything in it, the cliff and the river below, the 10,000 years of human presence that preceded the first stone of the first building. All of it, together, is what Parliament Hill is. Canada has not yet reckoned with that. The official story starts in 1867, or at best in 1826, and what came before is acknowledged in general terms of land acknowledgement, and not yet in the specific terms of archaeological investigation and genuine knowledge. Until that changes, the story of Parliament Hill will remain incomplete, and incomplete stories have a way of asserting themselves. The things left out tend to come back. The questions left unanswered tend to be asked again by different people in different ways with increasing urgency. The hill is patient, but patience is not the same as silence, and someday the ground is going to speak. End of script. There is a particular quality to the Ottawa River at dawn that people who have spent time near it tend to remember. The light comes in low over the Gatineau Hills, hitting the surface of the water at an angle that turns it briefly into something that looks almost luminous. The cliff face of Parliament Hill catches this light and holds it for a moment before the sun climbs higher and the effect dissolves into ordinary morning. It is a brief and quiet thing, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But it is the kind of thing that people who have lived along a river for hundreds of generations tend to notice, tend to name, tend to weave into their understanding of what the place is and what it means. The Algonquin people have words for the light on the Kichisibi that English does not have words for, not because they were more poetic than English speakers, but because they were paying a different kind of attention. When your survival depends on the land and the water, you develop a vocabulary for it that reflects the depth of your engagement. You notice things that people who can afford to ignore the environment do not notice. You name things that people who do not depend on them have no reason to name. And over generations, this vocabulary accumulates into something that is not just language, but knowledge. Compressed knowledge, ecological knowledge encoded in words and phrases and stories that carry more information than their surface meaning suggests. The loss of this kind of knowledge is one of the things that happens when a culture is disrupted, when people are forced off their land, when their language is suppressed, when the children who would have learned to pay this quality of attention are sent to residential schools. Instead, the knowledge does not just pause. Some of it dies. Some of it is lost in ways that cannot be recovered even with the most committed revitalization efforts. The language can come back. The community can regenerate. But the specific knowledge that developed over 10,000 years of intimate engagement with a specific landscape, that is harder to restore. It exists only as long as the people who hold it are connected to the land that generated it. This is another reason why the Parliament Hill question matters beyond its immediately archaeological dimensions. The land itself is part of the knowledge system. The physical place, the cliff and the river and the caves and the light on the water at dawn is not just the setting for the story. It is part of the story. Reconnecting Algonquin people to that land in meaningful ways, ways that include genuine stewardship and genuine decision-making authority and genuine access to the archaeological record of their ancestors' use of it, is not just a matter of justice, though it is that. It is a matter of preserving a form of knowledge that cannot exist anywhere else. There is a geologist at Carleton University whose work has touched on the subsurface structure of the Parliament Hill area, though not in ways that were specifically focused on the archaeological implications. His research on the Ottawa Valley's geological history has produced a body of work documenting the way the limestone bedrock of the region was formed, how it has been modified by erosion and dissolution over millions of years, and what the current subsurface structure looks like based on various forms of non-invasive investigation. His findings, published in technical geological literature, establish several things that are relevant to the archaeological question. The limestone beneath Parliament Hill is Ordovician in age, roughly 450 million years old, and it is highly soluble. Over geological timescales, water has worked its way through the rock along fracture lines, dissolving the carbonate and creating void spaces. The rate of this dissolution process has accelerated during certain periods, particularly during periods when the water table was higher or when the acidity of groundwater was increased by particular climatic conditions. The result is a bedrock that is, in certain areas, substantially honeycombed, not uniformly. The voids are distributed unevenly, following the structural geology of the rock, concentrated along certain fracture orientations and at certain depths. At depths relevant to human use, which is to say within the first 10 to 20 meters below the original ground surface, the void spaces in the Parliament Hill area are significant enough to appear in engineering surveys. They have been noted in assessments conducted in connection with the center block and with other buildings on the hill. They are a known feature of the site's subsurface geology, managed as an engineering concern. What the geological literature does not address, for the obvious reason that geologists are not archaeologists, is the question of what those voids contain. Geologically speaking, a void is a void. It may contain air, or water, or sediment that has washed in over time. From an archaeological standpoint, the same void is potentially something very different. It is a preservation environment, a place where organic materials that would decay in open conditions can survive, a place where materials placed deliberately by human beings, if such materials were ever placed there, would be protected from the weathering and biological processes that destroy most pre-contact organic materials at open-air sites. The combination of known significant void spaces and a site history of intensive pre-contact use creates a genuinely compelling archaeological situation. It is the kind of situation that, in any other context, in a site without the political and legal complications of Parliament Hill, would have generated sustained archaeological interest. In the Parliament Hill context, it has generated caution and controlled access. In 2015, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in a report on the situation in Canada, noted with concern the persistent gaps between Canada's formal commitments to Indigenous rights and the practical implementation of those commitments in specific contexts. The report identified a pattern in which formal processes of consultation and accommodation were used in ways that fell short of the standard of free, prior, and informed consent that international law requires. The Algonquin land claim and the archaeological dimensions of federally managed land within the claimed territory was not specifically mentioned in the Special Rapporteur's report, but the pattern the report identified applies with particular force to the Parliament Hill situation, a process of archaeological monitoring and Indigenous liaison that meets the formal minimum requirements of existing policy, but that falls short of what the spirit of reconciliation and the standards of international Indigenous rights law would require, is exactly the pattern that the Special Rapporteur was describing. Canada's adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was finalized in 2021 with the passage of Bill C-15, creates new legal context for this analysis. UNDRIP, as it is known, contains provisions about Indigenous peoples' rights to their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. It contains provisions about free, prior, and informed consent for decisions that affect Indigenous lands and cultural resources. It contains provisions about the repatriation of cultural objects and human remains. How these provisions apply specifically to the Parliament Hill archaeological situation is not yet fully worked out in Canadian law. The legislation implementing UNDRIP is framework legislation that requires further regulatory development to become fully operational. But the direction it points is clear. The existing approach to archaeological investigation and heritage management at Parliament Hill, which has been characterized by control and limited disclosure rather than open collaboration and Algonquin leadership, is increasingly difficult to defend under the evolving legal framework. There will be at some point legal and political pressure that forces a more thorough and more transparent approach. The question is whether that pressure will come in time to preserve what can still be preserved, or whether the opportunity will have been allowed to close through inaction and institutional inertia. Let me tell you about a specific feature of the Ottawa River that has rarely been discussed in connection with Parliament Hill, but that, once you know about it, is hard to ignore. At the base of the cliff below Parliament Hill, the river bottom is not uniform. There are areas where the bedrock is exposed, where millennia of fast-moving water have swept the river floor clean, and there are areas where sediment has accumulated, where the pattern of currents creates eddies that drop what they are carrying, and where material settles and builds up over time. These sediment accumulations at the base of the Parliament Hill cliff are, from an archaeological standpoint, interesting. They are river bottom deposits, which means they are not typically excavated and are not normally considered in the context of terrestrial archaeological assessments, but they are downstream from a cliff that has been eroding slowly since the last ice age. Material from the cliff face and from the ground above it has been washing into the river for 10,000 years, including potentially archaeological material. Underwater archaeology in freshwater environments is a recognized but relatively uncommon specialty. The conditions that make underwater sites difficult to investigate, poor visibility, strong currents, depth, the logistics of working underwater, also tend to make them good preservation environments. Materials that would have been disturbed or destroyed by agricultural activity or construction on land can survive essentially undisturbed at the bottom of a river. The river bottom below Parliament Hill has never been systematically investigated by underwater archaeologists. This is not surprising given the focus of Ottawa Valley as well as archaeological work on terrestrial sites. But it is a gap, and it is a gap that might contain information about the pre-contact use of the site that is not recoverable from the disturbed terrestrial record. Again, I am not claiming that there is a spectacular underwater archaeological site waiting to be discovered below the center block. I am noting that the question has not been asked in a systematic way, and that the failure to ask it is consistent with the general pattern of inadequate investigation that characterizes the archaeology of this site. There is something I want to say about the nature of archaeological significance, because I think it is sometimes misunderstood in public discussions of sites like this one. Archaeological significance is not the same as spectacular. A site does not have to contain gold artifacts or monumental structures or clearly identifiable objects of obvious aesthetic or commercial value to be archaeologically significant. Some of the most important archaeological sites in the world are significant precisely because of what they document about ordinary life, about the mundane and repeated activities that constitute the bulk of human existence in any period. A site where people cooked and made tools and slept and raised children for 10,000 years is significant, not because it contains spectacular things necessarily, but because of what it can tell us about how people lived, how societies were organized, how human communities adapted to changing conditions over long periods of time. Parliament Hill, in this sense, is potentially significant, regardless of whether there is anything dramatic buried in its depths. The mere fact of 10,000 years of sustained use of a strategically important location in a region with a rich and complex pre-contact history makes it a significant site. The conditions for preservation are favorable. The potential for the site to illuminate aspects of Ottawa Valley pre-contact history that are currently poorly understood is real. The scholarly value of a comprehensive and well-documented archaeological investigation would be substantial. This is worth saying clearly, because the public discourse about sites like this tends to be drawn toward the dramatic end of the possibility spectrum, toward hidden chambers and lost artifacts and buried treasures, and away from the quieter but genuinely important question of what systematic archaeological investigation of a significant site could contribute to our understanding of the human past. The dramatic possibilities are interesting, and I do not want to dismiss them, but the non-dramatic possibility that a comprehensive investigation would substantially enrich our understanding of 10,000 years of human use of the Ottawa Valley's most important location is itself a compelling reason to do the work. Let me take you back to the river one more time. The Ottawa River at Parliament Hill runs fast, not as fast as it does at the Chaudière Falls, a few kilometers upstream, where for centuries the river dropped over a dramatic limestone ledge that was one of the most important ceremonial sites in the entire Ottawa Valley. The Chaudière Falls, now largely harnessed by hydroelectric generation, were a place of such significance that virtually every Indigenous nation that traveled the Ottawa River had a tradition associated with them. They were the place where the river announced itself, where its power was most dramatically visible, where offerings were made to the spirit of the water. The Kichi-Sibi did not begin at Parliament Hill, and it did not end there. It was a presence throughout the valley, and the significance of any point along it was understood in relation to the significance of the whole. The Parliament Hill location was downstream from the Chaudière Falls by only a short distance. Anyone traveling the river would have arrived at the Parliament Hill cliff shortly after their encounter with the most powerful physical feature of the river. The combination of experiences, the falls, and then the cliff, and the river junction would have been part of how the location was understood and felt. This is the kind of contextual knowledge that gets lost when sites are assessed in isolation rather than as part of a larger landscape. The archaeological significance of Parliament Hill is not just about what is in the ground beneath it. It is about where it sits in a landscape that was understood and experienced as a whole. The falls, the cliff, the river junction, the hills to the north, the tributary rivers, the portages, the gathering places. All of these were connected in the geographical and cultural consciousness of the people who use them, and understanding any one of them fully requires understanding them all. This is an argument for landscape-scale archaeology, for the kind of comprehensive regional assessment that has been done in some parts of the world, and that has transformed our understanding of how pre-contact peoples organize themselves and use their territories. In the Ottawa Valley, that kind of comprehensive assessment has never been done. Individual sites have been investigated, some of them quite thoroughly, but the integrated regional scale picture that would really allow us to understand the pre-contact human geography of the valley has not been assembled. Parliament Hill sits at the center of that missing picture. It is the node around which the rest of the landscape organized itself, or at least one of the most important such nodes. Until it is investigated comprehensively and its findings integrated with the broader regional archaeological record, the picture will remain incomplete in ways that matter for our understanding of the whole. Here is something that I think is underappreciated in discussions of Canadian history and Canadian identity. The country that exists today was not built on empty land. It was built on land that had been home to human communities for thousands of years, communities that had developed deep knowledge of that land, complex social and political organizations for managing life on it, and meaningful relationships with specific places that included places like Parliament Hill. These communities did not disappear when Europeans arrived, though they were devastated by disease and displacement and the systematic dismantling of their social structures and cultural practices. Their descendants are still here. The Algonquin nation is still here, still asserting their connection to Kichi-Sibi, still pressing for recognition of rights that have never been legitimately extinguished. The buildings on Parliament Hill were built to house the institutions of a new nation, a nation that understood itself at the time of its founding as fundamentally a settler nation, as the continuation of a British colonial project that had been building for 2.5 centuries. The Gothic architecture, the British constitutional forms, the monarchy, the Union Jack incorporated into the Canadian Red Ensign, all of these were expressions of that self-understanding. They were not designed to acknowledge or accommodate the prior history of the land on which they sat. Canada in the 21st century is officially and formally a different kind of project. The formal commitments to reconciliation, to Indigenous rights, to acknowledging the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action all point toward a country that is trying to be something more than just the continuation of a colonial project. Whether it is succeeding, whether the gap between formal commitment and practical reality is narrowing or just being obscured by better rhetoric, is a question that different observers answer differently. The Parliament Hill archaeological question is, in this context, a test case, a concrete, specific, observable situation in which the formal commitments to reconciliation and Indigenous rights either are or are not being honored. It is not a test that requires great philosophical sophistication to assess. The question is simple. Has the Canadian government done everything that its formal commitments require it to do to ensure that the archaeological heritage of Parliament Hill is fully and openly investigated, and that the results are fully and openly shared with the Algonquin nation? The answer, based on the available evidence, is no. That no is not the end of the story. It is a point in an ongoing process. The story is still being written, but it is important to be clear about where we are in that story, and where we are is not yet where the formal commitments say we should be. I want to end this story by coming back to the river, because I think the river is where it belongs. The Ottawa River has seen a great deal. It has seen the retreat of the glaciers 10,000 years ago or more, when the land was raw and waterlogged and strange, and the first human beings were picking their way through the new terrain, following the animals north, finding the rivers, making note of the places where the landscape offered something particular. It has seen the slow accumulation of generations, the building up of the human story in this valley over centuries and then millennia. It has seen the arrival of the Europeans, the canoes of Champlain and his contemporaries, the trading networks and the missionary expeditions and the military operations, and all the complicated, painful, transformative history of contact. It has seen the building of the canal, the growth of Bytown, the construction of the Parliament, the development of the city that sprawls on both its banks today. The river does not forget any of this, not in a mystical sense, in a physical sense. The sediment at its bottom is a record. The limestone of its banks is a record. The archaeological sites along its edges, investigated or not, are records. The oral traditions of the people who have lived along it, carried forward through the difficult centuries of disruption and maintained against extraordinary pressure, are records. All of these records say the same thing, in different languages and different forms. This river has always been here. This place has always been important. The people who understood that importance, who named it and used it and built their lives around it, are not gone. They are still here, and they are still waiting for the recognition that has been promised and not yet fully delivered. The buildings on Parliament Hill were meant to stand for something. They were meant to stand for the best aspirations of a new country, for democracy and the rule of law and the principle that governance should be accountable to the people it governs. Those are not small aspirations. They are worth honoring, but honoring them fully in the 21st century in the context of what Canada now knows about its own history and the history of the land it occupies requires acknowledging that the story of Parliament Hill does not begin in 1867. It does not begin with Colonel By. It does not begin with Queen Victoria choosing Ottawa as the capital. It begins 10,000 years ago or more, when the first human beings looked at that cliff above the great river and recognized something in it that was worth returning to. Their story is Canadian history too, the most ancient, the most neglected, and in some ways the most important part of Canadian history. The part that tells you something true about the nature of the place, about how long people have found it significant, about what it actually means to stand on that hill above that river and look out over the world. The government of Canada has not yet let anyone dig deep enough to fully read that story. Maybe one day it will. Maybe one day the commitments will catch up with the reality, and the archaeology of Parliament Hill will be conducted with the comprehensiveness and transparency and Algonquin leadership that the site's significance and the principles of reconciliation together require. Until then, the hill is patient, the river is patient, and the ground holds its silence. But silence is not the same as emptiness, and the story is not finished. It is waiting to be told. There is one last thing worth saying, and it concerns the nature of what we do not know. Science, at its best, is honest about its own limits. The best archaeologists are not the ones who claim certainty about the past. They are the ones who are most precise about the difference between what the evidence establishes and what it suggests and what remains genuinely unknown. And in the case of Parliament Hill, there is a great deal that remains genuinely unknown, not because the answers do not exist, but because the questions have not been asked with sufficient rigor and sufficient resources and sufficient openness. We do not know the full extent of pre-contact use of the Parliament Hill site. We know it was used. We know the location is one that would have attracted sustained human attention over thousands of years. We know that the adjacent areas have produced archaeological material consistent with intensive occupation over long periods. But the specific character of the use of this specific location, what happened there, how it was organized, what it meant to the people who kept coming back to it, all of this remains to be determined. We do not know what was found during the original construction of the parliamentary buildings in the 1850s and 1860s. We have fragmentary references suggesting that something was found. We do not know what it was or what happened to it. It may have been destroyed. It may have been discarded. It may be sitting in a museum collection somewhere without proper provenience information, unrecognized for what it is. Or it may be in a storage room somewhere in Ottawa, known to a small number of people and not discussed. We do not know. We do not know what the subsurface voids beneath Parliament Hill contain. We know the voids exist. We know they are geologically significant enough to appear in engineering surveys. We know that the conditions within them are potentially favorable for archaeological preservation. We do not know whether those conditions have, in fact, preserved anything, and if so, what. We do not know the full extent of the Algonquin oral traditions about this site. Some of those traditions have been recorded, at least partially, by researchers over the decades. Others remain within the community, not publicly shared, held as knowledge that is not yet appropriate for outside audiences. This is a perfectly legitimate way for a community to manage its own knowledge, and it means that our public understanding of what the Algonquin nation knows about the ancestral significance of this location is necessarily incomplete. All of this unknowing is a choice in the sense that the resources and the political will to move from not knowing to knowing have been available and have not been deployed. That is the core of the Parliament Hill story, not a dramatic cover-up of a specific secret, not a conspiracy against archaeological truth, but a sustained pattern of choosing not to know, not to investigate, not to open the questions that the site raises, because the answers might be complicated and the complications might be uncomfortable, and the institutional incentives all point toward comfortable incompleteness over uncomfortable thoroughness. The questions are not going away. The Algonquin nation is not going away. The land claim is not going away. The formal commitments to reconciliation are not going away. At some point, Canada will have to decide whether it is going to honor those commitments in this specific and concrete and testable context, whether it is going to open the ground that it has been managing for a century and a half and find out, really find out, what is there. The hill above the river waits. The limestone holds what it holds. And somewhere in the language of the Kichi-Sibi, in the water that has been moving past that cliff for 10,000 years, in the oral traditions that have been carried forward through extraordinary difficulty and maintained against extraordinary pressure, the answer to the question of what Parliament Hill really is, what it has always been, what it was before the Peace Tower and the Gothic spires and the eternal flame, that answer is still alive, waiting to be heard, waiting to be seen, waiting for Canada to be ready. One more thing before this story closes. There is a recurring pattern in the history of places that carry great significance, places that have been used for long periods of time by communities who understood their importance, where subsequent occupants have built structures that physically cover what came before. This pattern shows up all over the world. In Europe, churches were built on top of pagan sacred sites. In Mexico, Spanish cathedrals were constructed from the stones of dismantled Aztec temples. In Jerusalem, layer upon layer of significance accumulates on the same contested ground across thousands of years of human history. The people who build on top of significant places are not always trying to erase what came before. Sometimes they are trying to appropriate its power. Sometimes they are simply building where it is practical to build, unaware of or indifferent to the history beneath their foundations. And sometimes they understand very well what is there and make a considered decision to build anyway, to assert through the act of building that what came before is finished, that the new structure and what it represents supersedes whatever the ground once meant to other people. The builders of the Canadian Parliament in the 1850s were, almost certainly, in the third category. They knew this was Algonquin land. They knew, in the general sense, that educated 19th century British colonial administrators knew that indigenous peoples had used this territory for a long time. They also believed, with the full conviction of the era in which they lived, that the old order was over, that what they were building was the future, and that the future had no particular obligation to the past, it was superseding. That belief was wrong, in ways that Canada is still working to fully understand and acknowledge. The past does not go away because a new structure is built on top of it. The ground holds what it holds. The people whose history is in that ground do not cease to have a relationship with it because they are displaced from it. And the meaning that a place accumulates over thousands of years does not evaporate when the political order that recognized that meaning is disrupted. Parliament Hill is one of the most powerful places in Canada. Not just politically powerful, not just institutionally powerful, but powerful. In the older sense, in the sense of a place where something significant has been happening for a very long time, where the accumulated weight of human attention and human action has made the location itself into something that exceeds any specific use or any specific period. The indigenous people of the Ottawa Valley understood this about the cliff above the great river long before Europeans arrived. The Europeans who built their parliament there, whether they knew it or not, were responding to the same quality of the place. What Canada has not yet done is fully honor both layers of that significance. the colonial layer and the 10,000-year layer beneath it. To do that would require opening the ground. It would require listening to the Algonquin nation as genuine partners in understanding what is there. It would require publishing the findings openly and letting the evidence speak for itself. That work remains to be done. The hill is waiting.